We've seen three major game changers. Basically, we had the protest on Friday with Greta Thunberg, 163 countries, civil society mobilizing itself. Then we see the states convening, coming together at the UN headquarters. And also you have business. Who do you think is the leading game changer in terms of the climate change agenda?
Well, I think clearly all three are essential, right? Because politicians can't go too far away from economic actors or citizens, voters, even voters of the future. But neither can businesses go too far away from customers or regulations. And until now, citizens have been largely quiet. So I think right now this is the, if you like, the year of the citizen movement really landing in climate change, changing the politics, provoking, stimulating, encouraging a even stronger reaction from business. I think 5 years ago in Paris, it was the year of the nation states and the multilateral system who really stood up together. And you know, in between, it's really been a story, I think, of the private sector gradually coming to realize that this is a problem we will solve because we have to. So being ahead of the curve of what the policymakers and what citizens are asking for is good for business. So we've seen a huge surge in business commitment. I think the latest movement from citizens is really encouraging a lot more. Tomorrow in the UN, there'll be an announcement of like the first nearly 90 companies who've committed to reduce their emissions to net zero. More than nearly every country has committed to so far. So it's always a game between, or not a game, but an interaction between those three actors.
We know of the Paul Pullmans of this world. We know about Unilever, for instance. How many companies are actually leading? Which are the companies that are at the forefront, in your judgment, leading the way?
Well, just to give you a couple of statistics. So one of the ways in which we look at this is through the lens of how have companies committed to the full transformation. So for example, when we started Women in Business in 2014, actually here in New York, 5 years ago, almost to the day tomorrow, the first 2 or 3 companies said, we will commit to 100% renewable energy in our operations. They launched a program called RE100. Then their peers thought they were kind of crazy, that it was impossible. That's nearly 200 companies now. It's become normal, it's not a surprise. At the same time, the first 3 or 4 companies committed to setting science-based targets, so reducing their emissions in their operations and their whole value chain in line with the science of 2 degrees. That's now 645 companies, and I say nearly 100 have now committed to that being net zero, so even more ambitious. I think in the early days it was mainly consumer goods companies, so more business to consumers, maybe a bit more citizen pressure or reputational issues. In a way, the most exciting thing in the last 12 months has been the fact that we now have leaders, or what I call zero naughts, where CEOs who've committed to getting to zero emissions in every sector. Maersk in shipping, Mahindra in India in automotive, in steel and chemicals. Of course, just this week, Nestle, a competitor of Unilever, but they've committed to net zero 2050. A couple of days ago, Jeff Bezos from Amazon, net zero by 2040. Mercedes cars, net zero by 2039. So every sector now you have zero noughts. You have more and more companies saying we'll get to zero because we know we have to. And seeing that as a driver of innovation. I mean, you have to find, whenever we're talking about systemic transformation, we have to find the language where we can meet each other. So I think if we pit economics against environment, that's challenging. So if we make it a trade-off, like either you can be green or you can be successful, that's problematic, right? Because if that's the framing, then anyone who wants to be successful is gone. They're not listening to anything. So for us, what's really interesting is when you start to see that taking action on climate change can lead to cost saving. So one of the reasons why more and more companies are now committing to renewable energy is it's saving them money. It's giving them stable energy prices. They enter into long-term power purchase agreements. CFOs like stability. They don't like volatility. So I think it's not about environment or economy. It's about the sweet spot where actually taking these physical constraints, the fact that we cannot continue to burn fossil fuels, jeopardize, damage the environment such that the feedback, we've had wildfires wiping out whole towns in California and Category 5 hurricanes striking the Caribbean 5 years in a row. This is not a problem that's going to happen somewhere else in 3 decades. It's happening right here, right now, in communities all around the world. And so it's not just about doing the right thing or being environmentalist. There is an inevitability to the policy change and the consumer change which will demand different products, different processes. So at the end of the day, there's a very strong economic argument, both microeconomically for individual companies, but also macroeconomically for whole economies, of getting ahead of this transition, because the laggards will become the losers when the transition really takes speed. We have many countries now which have put an end date on internal combustion engine sales. My country, UK, 2040. France also 2040. Other countries 2032, 2025 earlier. Ben van Beurden, who's the CEO of Shell, an oil company who sell a lot of products for internal combustion engines, he said recently in a speech in the UK that he would welcome the UK bringing forward the ban by 10 years to 2030. You just think about that. That's an incredible statement for a CEO. A CEO saying, I would welcome a law which bans the sale of my product. But he said that, and he was asked why. He said, because bringing that, we know it's going to happen in the 2030s. Making a law which says it will happen in 2030 removes all the uncertainty. It makes it much easier for me and my team to make decisions about capital allocation without the risk of policy uncertainty. So I think we're definitely seeing that, that technological and policy change. I think the other thing that's really interesting is the human element of the zero carbon economy. And we're seeing that there's a risk that we get this wrong, right? So you see this in the Gilets jaunes in France. If the low carbon economy is portrayed as something which serves an elite and which exacerbates the growing inequalities of trickle-down economics, then it won't succeed because society will react. So there is a need to also look at some of those fundamental social inequalities that many of our economies have built up.
Basically today we are extracting to sustain our economic, this huge internal combustion engine. It's 90 billion metric tons of natural resources. Now the projection is 180 billion. How on earth can you sustain this?
Well, we can't. We can't sustain an economy which is based on the extraction of finite resources. So we're going to have to transform that, and that's going to be a mixture of using the relatively infinite resources of the sun and the wind. So we go from hydrocarbons to renewables, but also then the far more effective circularization of materials. So we don't take, use, and dump, but we take, use, and then reuse and reuse and reuse and reuse. So a combination of tapping into the natural flows that we get from the sunlight, and then creating flows so that we're reusing materials.
How do you do that demographically when also you are projecting that you are having, because of the trickle-down effects of what was the markets as we know it, you still have 4.5 billion people that are less than $5?
Well, I think there's a few dimensions to that. I mean, first of all, have to realize that if we don't address that, we have an inequality issue within nations, but we have an inequality issue between nations. We're going to have a couple of billion plus more people in the world by 2050. More than 1 billion of them will be in sub-Saharan Africa. If we don't address the levels of inequality in the world, then there's a very strong migratory pressure out of Africa into Europe, and then you have all sorts of security and political consequences, which come up to a very scary world. And the world's security experts know that, right there. Climate refugees is one of the worst scenarios we have. So I think the first thing is to recognize this is a kind of transnational problem. That we have to really pay serious attention to livelihoods and sort of thriving economies around the world. It's a bit like climate, right? You can't just solve the climate in the UK. It's a global issue. I think the same thing economically and demographically. You can't just have a thriving economy in the UK if there's economic pressures elsewhere that are going to end up with a feedback loop.
I look at Twitter and social media, and a lot of people are wary, those that are still in doubt also, of the costs of climate change. You know, you might be wrong, and this is going to cost us dearly, is their argument. What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of research looked at what the cost of the transition will be. And remember, you have to compare the costs of acting with the costs of not acting. The costs of not acting are more and more severe weather events like the recent hurricanes and wildfires, which have very high economic costs, tens of billions. The costs of acting are predictable and going down. And just in my country, in the UK, we've just had an auction for offshore wind power, cheaper than coal-fired power. So the power of markets, the power of capitalism to innovate when we've got such massive markets like energy and mobility means that the costs are coming down really fast. And of course, in some countries, you have the possibility to leapfrog. You don't need to go through the whole phase of a dirty economy. If you haven't even developed it yet, you can go straight to a cleaner economy. So we actually know pretty securely that the cost of acting is going to be less than the cost of not acting, and the world that we'll create will be a quieter, cleaner, healthier, more prosperous world. And what often happens right in life is we find an approach or a solution that works, and then we just keep doing it because if it works, why not keep doing it? So at the heart of your question, I think, is the idea that having things cheaper or being able to get more stuff with the same amount of money is a universally good thing. Now, if you start with very, very little, so you're struggling to have enough food to eat or shelter or clothes to keep you warm, then it's universally true and obviously true that having more is better. But that ends at a point where more and better start to become a choice, right? So having more burgers, right, if they're not good for you, isn't better anymore. So having different burgers, so you go from an economics of quantity to more of an economics of quality. So the quality of the meat or the non-meat that you eat becomes more important to your health than the volume. And we see this, we have an epidemic of obesity driven by an economic engine that is predicated on the idea that more is always better. We know more is not always better.
Maravillosamente expuesto. Qué bien. Y finalmente, you're hopeful then.
Well, I think that hope is a choice. And I think what we see in the millions of young people and old people taking to the streets is an expression of fear, frustration, sadness, and I think that these are all really understandable emotions. I experience all these emotions when I read the science. If we don't act, there are bad scenarios. So fear, sadness, frustration, rage are understandable emotions. They don't necessarily lead to productive transformation. So I think we can either feel overwhelmed and despair, then nothing will change, or choose hope. And hope, I think, it's a moral choice to believe in the possibility of a better future and then to act towards it. You might not succeed. So yeah, I'm hopeful in the sense that I'm working with every sinew in my body towards a better future. And we have a chance of succeeding. And the more of us that work towards it, the higher that chance is. And it's really exciting to feel that movement growing with more young people, more CEOs, and more politicians every day committing to that transition.
Nigel, muchas gracias. Thank you very much.